Clare. Mandy Clare is a county councillor in Cheshire. She's currently an independent councillor, but she was a Labour Party councillor for Cheshire, which I'm sure we'll talk about very shortly. She's also an activist in Resist. Mandy, hello.
Hiya.
How are you? All right.
Very good, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Good, thank you. Welcome aboard. I wanted to talk briefly about your journey. So you're currently a councillor, a county councillor in Cheshire. Yeah. You originally were a Labour county councillor, but you're now an independent. So what's been your journey over the last 3 years or so?
So I joined the Labour Party. I've always been a socialist, always voted Labour. Felt that Labour was a completely hopeless lost cause in terms of the working class since the 1980s, basically. And I joined because of Corbyn becoming the leader, because I felt that was the first chance we'd had in decades of any semblance of a socialist government. And I felt like I should get involved. And then I decided to stand as a councillor, really because of that, because I wanted there to be some proper socialist left councillors as a backdrop to a Corbyn leadership, because I knew that we'd face a massive sort of backlash if he was actually elected to lead the country. So that's why I became a Labour councillor. And so over the last 3 years, obviously I've been learning about how the council works. I've been sort of exploring how far I can go with my role. I was also appointed as a leaders champion for poverty and inequality by the leader of, because Cheshire West and Chester is, it was no overall control at the election, but we had enough votes to be able to get the chair. So it's a Labour-led council, but it's kind of quite finely balanced. And I was appointed as leaders champion for poverty and inequality, and I pushed really, really hard to have a policy in place or a strategy in place that approaches policy as a social justice issue. So it's about systemic unfairness rather than individual failings or mistakes or laziness or whatever else, which I think is a Tory approach to poverty, but sadly an approach to poverty that's taken by a lot of Labour councils by default for some reason. And so I pushed quite hard on that. I was a member of CLPD executive for a couple of years as well. And I was approached by members of CLPD and asked if I would be prepared to stand for the National Women's Committee in the Labour Party. And I wasn't sure whether to or not, because I'd already started to form some, what you might describe as gender critical views. I had a lot of concerns about trans self-ID and the implications of that for women, and also in terms of children, education, healthcare and so on. And I didn't know whether having those views, I would be problematic to a left slate, the CLPD. But their view was that they didn't want to be pushed into a corner on it by Momentum, particularly. They didn't want to agree that the slate could only be made up of women who had a certain agreed viewpoint about trans self-ID, and that it would be healthier if the full range of views that women within the party have were represented on that slate. And they particularly wanted me to stand if I was willing to. And I did think about the potential abuse that might result from that, because I'd seen what had happened to other women who had gender critical views or who had concerns about any element of self-ID. I did think about the implications for my family, the safety of my kids as well. Because I knew that if I did agree to stand, I wouldn't stand on the basis that I was going to be quiet about my views. I wasn't going to hide them or pretend, tick a box so that I could have Momentum's backing as well as CLPD's backing. And I explained this to CLPD, and this was kind of understood. But we agreed that for the duration of the campaign, the main focus would be on issues that are unifying, that women can all agree on, which seemed fine and sensible. So I stood and I was elected. I got the second highest number of votes. I think I probably did quite well because I had the support of a number of women who had by this time had recognised that I hadn't been supported by Momentum. So that gave them an indication that perhaps I wasn't wholesale supportive of self-ID. So yeah, I did well in that election, and then I intended to be a voice really for that perspective on the National Women's Committee. But I came in for a lot of abuse for trying to do that, and I got absolutely nowhere in trying to foster a calmer, more accepting environment in which debate could, a solution-focused, evidence-informed, calm, respectful debate could take place. Anytime I asked for us to take a lead in creating that within the Labour Party, it was ignored. I was told that it was the wrong agenda item, or that trans women are women. It was just silenced, and it wasn't recorded in the minutes. And the only way that I could communicate with members that I was trying to do that was through my report that I was producing, to update people as to what I was trying to achieve. So that there were quite a few things that I tried to do as a member of that committee to combat some of the bias that I saw, and some of the silencing, and some of the undermining of democracy that was going on within the women's structure, but I got nowhere with it. And in the end, I was actually, the disciplinary system was turned against me in the same way that we've seen it turned against loads of other members for different reasons.
Okay, so you mentioned you believe that you hold what's called gender critical views, and I think it's fair to say that the debate is split along two lines: those people who advocate gender identity ideology, and those people who are gender critical. For people who are watching who don't fully understand what this is all about, could you briefly explain what each of the two sides of the argument say?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose the sort of gender identity side of the argument would be that people can change sex, that there can be more than one sex, there can be multiple, even I've heard it said that there can be multiple sexes. Gender is often conflated with sex. They are campaigning for trans women well, their slogan is trans women are women. So for people who are trans to be able to access the safe spaces that the Equality Act currently protects, or allows for protection for a single sex basis for women, biological women. They kind of, if you talk about biological women, they see that as a slur, and they see that as transphobic, and they see that as you erasing them, erasing their gender identity. So there's been a huge push from this perspective through organisations like Stonewall and the training that they provide. So they've got their equality, I think it's called Equality and Diversity Programme, and they've rolled out this training, and they've got kind of an awards system. And this training has been without really any public debate having taken place on women being consulted about any of this. They have rolled out this training throughout kind of every level and facet of society, every organisation that influences our culture and how we think about things and how we view like LGBT issues and equality issues. And a lot of it really ignores sex as a protected characteristic and the potential implications on women of any changes to those existing protections. So the gender critical viewpoint, I suppose, is where, and it's legally protected to have gender critical belief. And it's kind of the belief that most people within society have. So most people in society, if you interview them and ask women, how do you feel about trans people using women's toilets? They'll say, well, yeah, most women are kind, and they don't have a problem with that. But if you point out to women that most trans women are still fully intact, they haven't had any surgery, are you still okay with them using women's toilets? Most women say no, So I think the majority of the population could probably be described as gender critical. The law itself is gender critical in that sense, because it recognises that there are two sexes, there are men and women, and that a woman is an adult human female, and that certain spaces within society can be reserved just for women on the basis of their sex. We recognise in the law that that we live within a sexist society where women are at much, much greater risk of being harmed, assaulted, killed by men, and because of their sex, and that there are male patterns of offending, and all of our data and statistics show that. And interestingly, the best data that we have shows that when men transition, the male pattern of offending doesn't actually change, you know. So the law recognises this. So in a sense, the law could be described by people who follow the gender ID philosophy. It could be described as transphobic as well. Anybody who believes in there's two sexes and it's not possible to change from one sex to the other, and that there should be those certain protections in place for women on the basis of their sex because society is sexist and women are at greater risk, really are described as transphobic, as bigoted. And this ideology has caught on massively through the impact of the training that Stonewall has provided to the people working within the criminal justice system, the prison service, the courts, the media, you know, BBC, government departments, health, schools, councils. They've provided this training from this viewpoint, gender identity viewpoint, right across society. And young people have really, really picked up and run with the ball on this. And there's this culture of hatred and intimidation towards women, which has developed and almost been legitimized because they say that if you disagree with them, you must be an old-fashioned bigot, you know, some kind of old hag. But the law itself is transphobic if you want to look at it from their perspective, you know. So there's been a huge culture of no debate. There's been loads of silencing because of the stigma of speaking out and because of the threat that you feel as a woman when you speak out. As I've described, you know, it's a big consideration. And our culture has shifted without us really having had a chance to discuss, are we okay with this as women? Do we feel safe with this? It's not legal. It doesn't reflect what the law says. What are we going to do about that? We need to have maybe a national debate, but all of these changes in culture have almost happened under the radar before we've had a chance to have that conversation. And then we've been told, no, shut up, because if you try and debate it, that means by definition that you're bigoted and transphobic.
Yeah.
It's a horrendous situation. I'm really angry about it.
I can understand that. I mean, I just wanted to take a step back to your experience as a councillor. You said earlier on that there were a number of steps that were being put in place that were undermining democracy and things like that. What was your first-hand experience of that?
All right, so in terms of the Labour Party or the council, or is my role as a councillor?
As far as the Labour Party is concerned.
The Labour Party, yeah. So the National Women's Committee did used to exist, and then I think it was Blair got rid of it. I think, and then so years later we managed to get that back, and it was the first round of elections for it. So it was new. It's a new committee, a new structure. I mean, just for starters, it wasn't properly funded. So anything that we wanted doing, like one of the first things I asked for was for us, because it said within our terms of reference that we could have, like, you know, subcommittees to look at particular issues of concern and particular campaigns that we wanted to foreground really as the Women's Committee. So obviously, you know, violence against women, some of the things that women had identified through our conferences, the Women's Conference. And I asked if we could have subcommittees. One of them, I wanted it specifically to look at the absence of working class women within politics and within left politics, and how we could kind of open up that pathway to influence for women that are absent from politics. As the Labour Party, I felt strongly that we should be doing that, if anyone was. And I wanted a subcommittee to look at how we could create like a women's assembly, like a people's assembly, but for women, so that women can get together and have a look and discuss the evidence of all of the implications of this self-ID women's rights debate in a calm, rational, respectful way. So I wanted to try and get over that hurdle of no debate and actually have the conversation, so that, because the Labour Party policy actually sits on the fence. On the one hand, it says that we respect trans rights, you know, trans women are women, we're in support of self-ID. And on the other hand, it says we fully respect women's rights. We recognise, you know, disproportionate levels of violence, male violence against women, and the impacts of that, and we support single-sex spaces. So they recognise that there's two sexes. So their policy itself is transphobic, if you want to look at it that way. So really we should, as the Women's Committee, have been leading the way on trying to smooth the waters and say, no, this needs to be evidence-based, this needs to be solution-focused. I was told no, there isn't enough funding to resource having those groups. We're just going to have one subcommittee, and it's going to be on women's branches. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was that we just had the second ever National Women's Conference just before we were elected. The whole of the left slate got on, by the way, so that was, you know, a good indication of support from left women. And women had contacted me saying that they had been sort of shouted down within compositing meetings. So they brought motions forward which have been accepted. They've got over the hurdle. Some of them didn't get over the hurdle. So if they mentioned like women's rights or sex based rights or anything like that, a lot of the motions were ruled out of order by someone who also had it in for me. And no, they weren't given reasons. There was nothing given in writing to say this is the reason why your motion's been ruled out of order. And when they appealed, it was the same person basically that assessed those motions and again ruled them out. So some of the motions fell at that hurdle. The ones that did get through, they were told you can't talk about sex-based rights because that's against Labour Party policy and it's transphobic. They were just in the Zoom meetings and the compositing meetings, they were muted, you know, removed from the chat, those kind of things. So women sort of contacted me to say they'd also been cut off when they tried to speak on the platform as well about women's rights. So it's like these kinds of complaints are not coming from women who are advocating for trans rights. You're not hearing those complaints about party democracy from that side of the camp. It's only one side of the camp that's being silenced, you know, which is, it's sinister and it's anti-democratic. And I compiled all of these complaints from women, also complaints from women who said that when they'd gone for selections, parliamentary selections, they've been taken to one side and quizzed about their gender critical views and told, asked, you know, how are you going to manage if you are selected to stand in this seat? How are you going to manage Trans Awareness Day? You know, given the views that you've got and things like that. So they knew that they weren't going to be selected. They knew that they weren't being assessed fairly and that they were being discriminated against because of those views. Because no one was asking people who didn't have those views this an equivalent question. So I was kind of the councillors who told me that they'd been threatened with being removed from the selection panel, serving councillors who were wanting to stand again. And that's something that eventually did happen to me. But at that time, I was trying to support those women, and I put together a report, took it to the Women's Committee, and I was told that I couldn't present that because it wasn't an official Labour Party document. I asked if it could be presented to the Women's Conference Arrangements Committee, and I was told that no, it couldn't, but they would be willing to share it with the chair of the Women's Conference Arrangements Committee. The chair of the Women's Conference Arrangements Committee the whole time, from the point when I was elected, was online publicly calling for my resignation, calling me a TERF, calling me a bigot, you know, openly online. So it needed to be shared with the whole committee, and it wasn't shared with them. It wasn't minuted even that I'd asked about it, so I had to challenge the minutes. So the whole thing was like every time we had a meeting, I had to challenge and say, I raised this point, and this point, and I asked for this information, and it hasn't been recorded in the minutes. And again, it just wasn't recorded in the minutes. You know, there was lots of tutting and head shaking and eye rolling, and nobody, even the women that agree with me, they all felt that that was pushing it too far too soon, that was pushing too far, that the work needed to happen behind the scenes and more gradually, and that they would just close down from pushing that hard. I myself didn't feel like it was pushing too hard. I felt like women are, you know, having to be imprisoned with men, most of the women that are in prison have been abused by men, most of them, and are traumatized, and they're being re-traumatized by policies that haven't been publicly consulted on and haven't been informed by evidence. You know, it's not trauma-informed practice. So, and also what's happening in women's sport, which has now hit the headlines since. What's happening to women in terms of them just being silenced, it's really sinister. It's really worrying. There's loads of other stuff that you can talk about that's really worrying. And I felt I'm not on this committee to be quiet about this. I'm here to try and make sure that we're discussing these concerns, and that where women are not able to access the democratic process, we're addressing that. There's no point in being here otherwise. And to be honest, I didn't want to be in the Labour Party much longer anyway, so I thought I might as well go all out, which is what I did.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So the idea of stifling debate is anathema to most political parties. Most political parties believe in free debate and, you know, discussing differences and trying to find common ground. Why do you think the Labour Party was so adamant that they were going to stamp out debate? They were going to stop people with opposing views from making their views known?
Well, I think that, well, I think they have a close relationship with Stonewall. I think the Labour Party, the left of the Labour Party, here's my honest opinion, the left of the Labour Party isn't a strong, solid, rooted left. It's just not. It's not a working class left. It's not a left that's grown up out of daily grind and hardship and is angry about it. That's not the left of the Labour Party. 70% of the Labour Party members are actually middle class, you know. So they've learned a lot about socialism through reading Marx, deciding that they are working class on that basis alone. And it's no more nuanced than that for them. They're quite happy to have something to feel oppressed, to be part of an oppressed class, which they are, you know, in terms of capitalism. Yeah, you know, you have a manager, you're answering to the man, you're part of the machine, the profit-making machine, you're not the guy at the top. You're not the owner and controller of the means of production. So yeah, technically you're part of the working class. But Marx also described a petty bourgeoisie that helps to cement that whole system in place by just not really fighting back and speaking up and being part of the resistance, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what's been replicated by accident through the Corbyn movement. And I really tried hard throughout the whole thing to try and sort of put my hand up and say, hang on, I think it's going to be a stronger movement if we can try and make sure it's integrated, not so snobby about the working class, recognises that in the same way that white people will take up space without realising it, where there's a mixed race environment, and men will take up all the air in the room when there's, you know, a male dominated environment, or even a mixed sex environment. You know, middle class people also do that. They've got their networks, they recognise each other, the way that they speak, their culture, it's more acceptable to them, so they promote each other into these positions. He's all right, he's not going to be too much, he's not going to rebel, he's not going to, or she isn't going to, you know, be too outspoken, they're going to toe the line. We know we can trust them, they're one of us, kind of thing. And it was, I think the culture, just that just middle class, inward focused culture intensified through the Corbyn movement. And also middle class people are really comfortable when there's a hierarchy and there's celebrities and people that they can sort of look up to, or even be a member of the inner circle themselves in some way, have those connections. That's really important to middle class people. I've found, you know, as a working class people within middle class environments my whole life, you know. So I went to grammar school as a working class kid, went to university as a single mum, teenage mum, you know. I've worked in as managed like sort of domestic abuse service, managed family support project in North Birkenhead, you know, which is where I lived as a teenage mum in a bedsit. So I've kind of come full circle and always been surrounded by middle class people and middle class culture, and that's how it works. And if you talk to working class people who go into like academia, or they go into the arts, or they go into the law, legal, you know, whatever, wherever you go, you're never going to get as far as if you were middle class, because you're not part of that culture. They know it, they sense it, and you kind of know it about them. And it's a hard thing to describe, but it explains, and it's been studied and proven when talking about class and classism wasn't taboo, you know, that all of these kinds of mechanisms reinforce class structures and hold things in place. And so middle class people, in the same way that white people need to consciously try and move aside to make sure that we have multicultural influence, you know, structures of influence, in the same way that men need to move aside and we need all women shortlists. We need to do that consciously. Well, we also need to do it around class and classism. And I tried to make this point throughout the Corbyn movement, but it just gets you hated. because people who are middle class never want to hear that they're middle class. You know,
Yes.
it's really
Yeah,
offensive
absolutely.
to them.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, I know from personal experience. I've had long conversations with socialists who were from a middle class background, and they felt almost that they had to apologise for their background.
Yeah,
They felt they were granted certain privileges that working class people were not.
no one's fault, is it, where you're born? It's just a fact.
No, that's right. That's right. But I think it's also essentially true, and it's been written about in all kinds of political philosophies, that the middle class tend to get pulled along by the most dominant class at that time, be it the ruling class or the working class. And unfortunately, that's always been the problem with the middle class, isn't it? It's been floating between these two big layers, and it's dragged by whichever one is dominant at any particular time.
Yeah, and there's this thing about needing to get on. I think middle class people are raised to conform and to know who to make friends with and what to say and what not to say in order to get on, you know, to sort of, you know, climb the greasy pole, as it were. Working class people aren't as strategic about it. I think we're more straightforward and honest, and we're more likely to be angry, and we're more likely to speak our mind and blow it for ourselves.
Yeah.
But we're not as gullible either, on the plus side, you know. So when you've got like this culture, which is mainly teenage kids yelling at like older women, you know, like we've seen in Manchester the other day, once you've got that, or once you've got like a man standing in a woman's swimming costume next to tiny women, you know, it's like middle class people will conform to hell and back in order not to be ostracized, whereas working class people are much more likely to say, sod that, you know, what I'm seeing before me is something that's unfair and is regressive, and it's not okay, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask, it's a thing that I've been turning over in my mind for some time, and it's about people who identify themselves as socialist. And it speaks a little bit to what you've just said about how the middle class sit within the system and how they sit within the left as it stands today. Do you agree that there are a number of people on the left, ostensibly from middle class backgrounds, who use identity politics as a signifier of their socialism?
Yeah, I do, and I think socialism. You see, I learned about socialism as a young kid who'd been working class within a middle class environment within school, not really been able to make sense of it. You can sense that there are differences, and that there's snobbery, and that there's favoritism, and that there's things that you can't join in with, you know, because of financial, like you can't go on a skiing trip, and you really maybe don't have the confidence to throw yourself into all the sporting, you know, clubs and competitions, stuff like that. They've got a lot more self-confidence, self-assurance. Sometimes it's overconfidence in relation to their actual skill.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like, but grow up not really understanding that. And then I studied sociology at A level, and in the 80s, sociology was mainly about class and classism, you know, and about the research and studies that had actually been done about the effects of classism on working class kids within the classroom. You know, working class kids within the workplace, the impact of wage progression, you know, working class kids that have exactly the same qualification as a middle class kid over the course of their lifetime, how class reinforces itself, you know, all of these kinds of, like in the same way that we study colonialism and neo-colonialism, you know, and the impacts of how some countries keep other countries down and keep them disempowered economically, and etc. It's the same thing in a microcosm when you're looking at it within the UK in terms of class. And people used to understand that, teach about it, learn about it, be able to talk about it. And people within unions also used to be educated about that, understand it,
Absolutely.
you know, and have other people within the workforce that they knew, because workplaces were not as disparate, you know, they weren't as atomized as they are now. So communities of working class people were able to discuss these things between them and get angry amongst themselves and take actions collectively in a very different way. You know, it's not really available to people in the same way, either in unions or within academia. You know, so if you talk to someone like Lisa McKenzie, and she is an academic, and her area of expertise is sociology, she will say, yeah, you know, classism within that whole curriculum of sociology has shrunk to virtually nothing, and it's been overtaken by all of these other isms. It's not that they shouldn't be there. It's just that without understanding classism and making sure that working class people have a foothold within left politics, socialism is nowhere. It's not going to happen. There's no way it can ever happen. And what shocks me is that people like Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, who are very learned, very well respected, really decent human beings, you know, all of the decisions that they take, really, you can't argue with them. They seem to be oblivious to this whole area of classism and how the working class awareness and education around that, making space for working class people, is an essential component of socialism. It's not going to happen by a bunch of middle class people who are more concerned with, you know, what do you call it, like international policy and the environment. Working class people can't relate to that. They don't have time to think about, you know, Palestine, Bolivia, or, you know, carbon emission. They just don't have the luxury and the time to think about those things. They're not their immediate crushing issues. And there's just this huge disconnect, and it's a missed opportunity. I think it's been a massive missed opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's fair to say, well, I don't know whether you agree with me, but I think one of the fundamental failures of the Corbyn project was his failure to engage with the working class. He was able to engage with certain privileged layers of the working class, people who work in the public sector and the more unionised end of the working class.
Yeah.
But the other huge section of the working class that were not unionised and worked in the public sector were largely ignored. However, he was able to mobilise the middle class.
Yes.
As we've discussed, they ostensibly are one of the most unreliable sections of the class structure to rely on when you need to create a workers' movement.
Well, they've been frigging useless for women. I'm sorry, I've sworn.
That's all right. That's okay.
They've been useless for women.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
And it was. I mean, one could almost argue that it was possibly Corbyn's own class background that was his undoing.
Yes, I think so. And that's not his fault.
No, of course not. No, absolutely. But it was that lack of class consciousness that pervaded the whole Corbyn project that was its downfall, in my view.
Absolutely. And also think, like, when working class people hear someone who's genuinely angry about poverty and classism from a working class perspective, they recognise it. They recognise the difference between someone who is. I mean, I'm not going to say. I know that Corbyn is concerned about poverty and injustice and inequality. But I guess, like, when that's expressed, it's usually expressed as a tiny issue amongst all of these other issues which are magnified for middle class people. Not that they're not important, you know, but that it takes up a tiny amount of space in comparison when it's everything to people's lives if they're working class, you know. And it's not always expressed in a way that a working class person would express it themselves. And if we had just made more room for politicized left, genuine left working class people to have a foothold in what the face of that movement looked like, how it was speaking to the public, I think it would have made all the difference in terms of our cut through. I also think we wouldn't have been as gullible and ridiculous on the referendum. We needed, whether it was right or wrong, we needed to respect democracy on that vote, you know, and we lost the working class as a result of not doing that. And if we'd had more working class people at the centre of that power structure, informing policy and having their voice heard on that and having that perspective heard on that, I don't think we'd have made that shift. It was a fatal shift. I tried to raise it in CLPD because we were asked within the CLPD exec, what do you think about this? There's you know, some thoughts about shift in policy on that. It was presented as being a positive move. I spoke up, a couple of other people spoke up, but we were drowned out by the middle class Marxist reading left, you know, and they got it wrong.
Absolutely. And again, you know, I hope this interview doesn't come across as a character assassination of the entire middle class, but the volte-face that Labour made on Brexit was essentially driven by the middle class elements within the Labour Party.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was a complete manifestation. I mean, I did have an argument with someone who was of a Trotskyite persuasion, or at least had a Trotskyite background, and they said, well, I want you to stay in the European Union because it's essentially internationalist. And I thought to myself, have you actually read the Lisbon Treaty? You know, do you understand how anti-socialist the European Union is?
Yeah.
And the point is that you're absolutely right. Once we'd made the decision to leave, a decision that was ostensibly made by the working class,
Yes, it was.
Labour should have stuck with it.
Yeah.
Regardless of its internal divisions, regardless of what the middle class thought of it, regardless of the people who wanted to send their kids to Spain to go to university and all that sort of thing.
Yes.
It was a decision that was made by the majority in this country, and it should have been followed through.
Yeah, I think most of the working class who are now disengaged from politics lost their faith in Labour during the sort of Blair years and just given up, don't even vote. They, like you say, they're not sending their kids on Erasmus schemes and things like that, and they're not travelling to France in their camper van or whatever it is. It's like they don't access Europe in the same way that the middle class do, just as a normal thing. So, but that's outside of the middle class person's frame of reference, because to them, that's their normality, is European integration. You know, it's really precious to them, and also the association with racism of voting Brexit. Either way, that's what the country voted. If it was as a result of the working class being swayed by dog whistle, media, that's what it is. But if we'd have respected that vote and we'd have got into number 10, we could have sorted out some of those things, in any case, and we could have had a very, very different Brexit than the one that we've been landed with. We missed that opportunity. And I honestly do think if we'd have had more working class people stitched in to that central structure and as the face of the party, and if that central leadership had more respect for working class people and working class culture, and they didn't look down on it, they probably don't mean to, then I think that would have happened. They'd have recognised that that's been decimated deliberately by Tony Blair over the years that he had control of the party. It was very, very deliberate, and they've been decimated from the influential structures within the unions as well. And they would have immediately, because that would have been job number one, start putting that right. We need the working class to trust this party again. We need to have them making the decisions at the upper levels within the unions as well. Yeah,
absolutely. I think from my point of view, I think under Blair, and I think it's coming through under Sir Keir Starmer, they're returning to this philosophy where they want to make the political battlefield as small as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They believe that they have a better chance of winning power by having as few people engaged with the process as possible. Yeah. And one of the first things that Labour did under Blair was to disengage the working class from politics.
Yeah.
And what we have now, in my view, is a Labour Party that believes that the working class are the object of their politics and not the subject of their politics. They're people. They actually treat them like a charity case, don't they? It's almost like, we want to help you, and if you don't vote for us, you must be a bigot or a racist or stupid or ill-informed, or you read the Daily Mail or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's difficult for me to work out how the working class will ever return to Labour, where their attitude to them is like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. But you were asking about the woman question and the Labour Party, and why is the Labour Party taking that particular position? Why have they allowed this debate culture to prevail, and why have they backed it up? And they have actively backed up, even though, like, Starmer now tries to win some points back because they've embarrassed themselves. He will try to say, it's so condescending, he'll try to say, we need to try and calm things down, and it's been equally hostile on both sides. It absolutely hasn't. You haven't had women it was quite a funny thought. We haven't had women dressed head to toe in black with just their eyes visible, turning up at trans people's events and meetings, to intimidate and threaten them and block them from standing near their own statues. You haven't had that sort of undermining of democracy, of their views within the Labour Party, but also the Green Party is just as bad. I think the Tory Party has been as bad, and is that this is the dangerous thing, is that Tories are now looking into how children are being assessed and supported and treated if they are distressed. They're now wanting to make sure that any support that's offered is exploratory, and that they're doing their due diligence in terms of safeguarding and making sure that there aren't other issues there. There's not been abuse, that the child isn't autistic, and that the child doesn't have some other issue going on that needs addressing, rather than just affirming them, in their new gender identity or in their confusion. And the Green Party, they've got someone called Dawn Furness has alleged that she's twice been assaulted for questioning the trans policy. She says that some officials were seen shouting "TERF" as they watched her on TV, and I've been called TERF by the disciplinary people that represent the disciplinary process within the Labour Party. They actually brought that term up and said, would you describe yourself as this? And would you be willing to say the things that you've said if there was someone trans in the room? I've got lots of trans friends. So the whole thing is really, really biased against women. Women have been losing their jobs, you know, and they've had to take their employers to court and gone through the hassle and the distress of tribunal. So Alison Bailey now, my force-debtor before, but there's other women as well that aren't as high profile. This has not been happening to people who are trans, you know, or who identify as trans. This is stuff that's been happening to women, and it's women who've been silenced. It's women who are being threatened with rape. It's women who've had their language taken away from them. You know, in the newspapers now, if someone identifies as a woman and they're a rapist, it's described as them having raped with her penis. You know, it's kind of the word mother is being eroded. Pregnant people instead of pregnant women, cervix havers, chest feeders. You know, it's kind of it's insulting, really, for this to have happened without anyone consulting women as to, are you okay with this? And I can tell you now, most working class women, not left wing, you know, or right wing even, middle class, you know, Labour women, but most working class women, however they identify politically, would tell you that they're not okay with that. But they haven't even been asked. This is how little is thought of women. So for Starmer to present it as it's equally toxic on both sides, and women just need to calm down and everybody needs to calm down as if he's the grown up in the room. He's actually ignored and suppressed and allowed the bullying of women, you know, to take place within the party. That's happened on his watch, and he needs to be apologising for it. Never mind telling people to calm down. He needs to apologise for being complicit in what's happened to women, what's happening to women.
Yeah. I mean, I want you to ask. It's a quite open question, but do you think the left is misogynistic?
Not everybody, no, of course not. But I think the whole of society is a lot more misogynistic than I thought it was. Even I thought it was. See, the thing is, if you're subject to misogyny as a woman, and it's ingrained within the whole of society, it's your normal. So it's sometimes hard to even identify the degree of it, if you know what I mean. And you can make assumptions that because we have equality laws and protections, you know, that we've put in place, that maybe attitudes have shifted and that men do regard us as equal. But I think what's been really shocking through this whole thing is how unimportant women's feelings, opinions and views about their own words, language, even how we describe ourselves. It's just assumed as well that a man can know how it feels to be a woman, you know, without having been a woman. That's given him immediate respect. And yet this undermining of women's language and rights women have been just labelled, you know, bigots and abused for trying to stick up for them. We're now seeing a beginning of a turning of the tide kind of thing from government. And obviously the danger of that is that because left men haven't spoken up for women, and because the left have been so middle class and so bloody vulnerable to this trend, if you like, of a trend of abuse. I'm not saying a trend of self-ID, because if someone identifies as a sex other than the one that they were born as, that's a distressed person who needs to have timely and appropriate support. End of story. You know, they're entitled to that and they should have that. And however they want to identify should be respected, and they should have those rights in place. But because women have rights on the basis of their sex, you can't just throw that away and ignore it. You know, women have to be allowed to have a voice in this. And because the left and Labour Party haven't stood up for women, it's been left to the Tories to be the grown-ups in the room on this issue. And that then gives them license to talk about things like political correctness gone mad, you know, and turn some of those things against us as they have done in the past and make us look ridiculous, make the whole of the whole socialist left look ridiculous, look gullible, look like they don't care about women as much as the right wing do. That's a really dangerous position for us to be in. And people like Starmer, people like the Green Party with their policies, you know, that ignore sex-based rights. The Green Party are even advocating for the unionisation and taxing of sex, you know, to make that, and let's include that in our capitalism and make that a commodity as well. Abused women, let's make that further abuse of those abused women a commodity, and I mean, it's so sickening. I can hardly even talk about it. And, you know, this is what's passing as normal on the left, and it's allowing the right to look as if they are more reliable. What the hell? You know, we need to sort that out. We need to have a left that will stick up for women and that will allow women to talk about these things openly without being shouted down, intimidated, you know, in the way that we've seen recently. There was a woman physically assaulted by one of these kids dressed up in a head-to-toe ninja outfits in Manchester yesterday in St. Peter's Square by Emmeline Pankhurst Rise Up Women statue. And it was caught on camera, and the police were there and they witnessed it. And apparently, according to the woman herself, the police went over and asked the woman to move, asked her to move. This is how far, you know.
The woman had been assaulted.
Yes, they witnessed it. And then it was her that they had a word with. I saw them on camera and I thought they were saying, "Are you okay? Do you want to press charges?" You know, they weren't, they were asking her to move. I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
It's difficult to know where to start to try and unpack all this, isn't it? Because on the face of it, a lot of it makes very little sense. You know, you've got an assaulted woman who's being told that essentially they created the problem and they should be moved on.
Yeah.
You've got, as happened on Sunday, a lot of protesters surrounded the Emmeline Pankhurst statue, which forced the women who were there to create their own little speakers corner, had to do it over the other side of the street. What do you think the problem, or one of the problems that's at hand here, is what you were saying about the fact that the left media, such as it is, and it isn't very substantial, the left-wing media in this country anyway, but it's largely deserted its post on this debate, and it's allowed publications like the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, the Times, and right-wing commentators as well to fill that space. And it's created a situation whereby the left are framing gender critical views as right-wing views.
Yeah. So I was listening to, there was a podcast that I was listening to the other day, and they were unpacking this whole thing about wokeism, you know, and the thing about punching up or punching down, and people who are on the gender identity side of it, they describe women who are, you know, trying to articulate their rights and their concerns about this as punching down. And we've lost that sort of, I don't know, it's like, well, where are women in that, or where are women's rights in that, you know? And punching down used to mean people who have privilege attacking people who are disadvantaged by the system itself causes their disadvantage. The system itself relies upon them being disadvantaged. That's basically the working class. So, so right-wing politics does that to the working class, but right-wingers are being able to use this idea of punching down and make it sound as if it's kind of ridiculous, and it's a term that's just used within woke culture, if you know what I mean. So yeah, I think it means that anybody who's on the left is accused of being woke and ridiculous. And if some people on the left would have just, I mean, like within the media on the left, so the most reliable left outlet, social media outlet, I won't name who that is, but the one that I think has been the most reliable and consistent in speaking out throughout all of the attacks on Corbyn, all of the attacks against members who've been accused of being anti-Semitic because they support Palestine and they oppose the Israeli government and an military complex. They have not gone near this issue. They haven't. They did publish a statement that I made on why I'd left, because I chose International Women's Day to leave. I was getting pushed out anyway. They sort of mobilised the disciplinary system against me, more or less accused me of being a turf within the meeting that we had. And then they probably would have just kept me hanging on to wait to expel me when they're just before the next election, so that they have time to install a new candidate. And they still have the numbers on the council, because we're very finely balanced within the council. So they'd probably kept me dangling, you know, for the best part of a year. And I would have felt silenced for the best part of that year, and it would have had, you know, all of that hostility to deal with and so on. So I just decided to leave and speak publicly about some of the things that had happened within the Women's Committee and so on. Yeah, so this left media outlet, who normally doesn't shy away from publishing anything in defence of people that are on the left, that are good socialists, known to be good socialists. They did publish a story, but they've held back from interviewing me. I've been offered the opportunity to conduct an interview and to choose who I want to interview, or to have a group discussion or whatever, but they themselves don't want to interview me on it. And I think that's the level of fear of being smeared and labelled as, you know, being bigoted and supportive of turf women.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on the events that we've spoken about already in Manchester on Sunday.
Yeah.
You said you weren't able to go, but what were your interpretations of what you saw unfold in Manchester on Sunday?
Well, the women, see, I follow Posy Parker, who's Kelly J. Keane, who's got she's set up the organisation called Standing for Women. So she's put up these billboards which says adult human female, which is the dictionary definition of woman, and it's also how it's described in the Equality Act. And she sells t-shirts. She sold t-shirts and merch in order to fund that billboard. And that's what she does. She raises money through selling merch. So she was the woman who went over to the States when Leah Thomas was competing against women in that race. Now, she's regarded as being very, I don't know, I think the middle class left who are gender critical are quite snobbish about her, and they shy away from being associated with her work for some reason. Whereas someone like Graham Linehan, who does the Mess We're In podcast about updating about all of the different developments around this issue, he's the writer of Father Ted, and he's been cancelled and blacklisted, and he's lost his career, lost his marriage, you know, basically because of the amount of abuse that's been. And it's very organised, the way that people, you know, make sure that anyone who speaks out is discredited and punished for doing so. It's not equal, it doesn't happen in the other direction. So he will cover Posy Parker and the stuff that she does in her activism and celebrate her approach. I think the way that she expresses it, for some women, it's going to feel as if it's going to discredit, you know, what we're trying to achieve. I don't really think so. I think people need to be able to express their views, as long as they're legally held views, and they're not doing it maliciously, you know, to be mean or whatever. She's very straight talking to the letter of the law, and she will not compromise at all on our language, you know. So there are two sexes, there are men and women. It's not possible to change sex, and the minute we start to give away ground on that, then we start to see the kinds of things that are happening where, you know, he raped her, she raped her with her male, you know, with her penis. Or we've got like a woman in a hospital ward recently in the UK who said that she had been raped, was told by hospital staff it couldn't possibly have happened. It didn't happen, which is what women have always been told for centuries. They get disbelieved. And this was again happening, you know, in modern UK Britain. And she was told that because it was an all-women ward, a single-sex ward, it wasn't possible for it to have happened. There was someone on there who was trans, but they wouldn't say that. It was only when it was investigated and they were able to see video footage which backed up what she'd said, that this trans-identified man had followed her down the corridor and had raped her. But the fact that she was told it couldn't have possibly happened, because this is what happens when we confuse these concepts of men and women. And maybe there needs to be separate provision for people who are trans, particularly given that the evidence at the moment tells us that, of course, being trans doesn't make you a sexual predator, any more than being a man makes you a sexual predator, but the incidence of, sexual assault and rape amongst trans people doesn't alter as a result of them transitioning. It's still a lot. I mean, let me give you the figures. So there's 80,000 men who are in prison and 3,000 women who are in prison, and 12,000 of those men are sex offenders. So these are the kinds of proportions. It's less than 1% of women that are sex offenders that are in prison. So there's no comparison in this, and that's why we have safeguarding. It's not because every man or every trans person is a paedophile or that we think they are. It's just that we know that there's a higher proportion and we're at greater risk, and we don't know who that's going to be. So that's why we have single sex spaces. So she's like, Kelly J is really clear on all of these things and she doesn't compromise on them. And the way that she expresses that offends some people. But she has succeeded in shining a spotlight on these issues where the more flaky, lefty, careful middle-class women have actually made no impact at all. Working carefully and quietly behind the scenes results in nothing other than Starmer saying something really wet like, we have to calm everyone down, and it's, and meanwhile, women are being bullied out of the party and trans people aren't, so it's kind of, there's a whole lie that's been allowed to develop around this. And Posey Parker does a brilliant job of just breaking all the way through that, sometimes through being offensive. Okay, that's all right with me. If it achieves the aim of actually women being heard and listened to, if that's what we have to do, then I'm fine with it. So she organised this event in Manchester. They were going to stand by Emmeline Pankhurst's statue. She probably knew exactly what was going to happen because she's smart, and predictably, but no one could have predicted the ninja angle on it. And it's been a known goal because you've had really aggressive kids. You've had a woman who's been assaulted in the presence of the police and they've asked her to move on. The women had to have the event across the other side of St. Peter's Square. The irony of that, the irony of it, just the fact of it being in St. Peter's Square, I can't even know what to say. And then, but they happened to have been moved in front of what was billboards which had pictures of women who've been killed by men. And they had different women. She provides an opportunity for women from the public who aren't part of this like hierarchy of the Labour Party or the Labour left or any other hierarchy. They're just ordinary women who turn up and share their story, share their concerns, and are fighting collectively to raise awareness around this issue and the deeper implications of it for women, for kids in schools, for women in prisons, for how we're collecting our data, our crime statistics. Women nearly were erased from the census. The government were going to run a census just asking about gender identity, not asking about sex. So that immediately begins to unravel all of the insights that we have that enable safeguarding, that keep women and children safe. The whole thing is a lot more involved than trans women are women. It's a lot more involved than that. And women as a sex haven't been allowed to have their voice and their place in this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to bring the interview to a close shortly, but I wanted to end with one question. How do you believe we can reconcile these two opposing beliefs, the gender critical side and the gender identity side? Is there a way that a compromise can be found?
I think there is. I think that we need to have specialist services and spaces, toilets, changing rooms, in the same way that we've made space for people within the Disability Act. I think we need to recognise that, what the evidence tells us is that where children are gender confused, in the vast majority of cases, if you take a watchful waiting approach and you support that child, that they'll turn out to actually be gay. So trying to stem that, with puberty blocking hormones raises huge questions about whether you're erasing being gay, if that's a form of gay conversion therapy by default or proactive without meaning to be. So I think that we have to recognise that despite that, there will be some people who will still feel dysphoric about their gender beyond puberty, and that will need to have proper, psychological and medical support and appropriate spaces within society if they're vulnerable or abused, if they require privacy, you know, for changing or for going the loo or whatever it is. I think we just need to, as a society, accept that some people are going to come through that puberty net and still feel like that. And that's part of our human family, if you like, and we have to make space within society for that in the same way that we have done for women and, you know, that we have done for people who are gay. At the moment, because this is what the question you asked me before that I forgot, it was about the word "ter." So I was asked by the Labour Party, do you consider yourself to be a ter? And they said, because that's not offensive, is it? You know, it spells out trans, exclusionary, radical feminist, and that's what you are, isn't it? And I said, it's an abusive term. It's only ever used in an aggressive, abusive sense towards women. But the other thing about it is that we're not trans exclusionary. Women who identify as men, but who are women, you know, they're biological women, are perfectly welcome within women's single-sex spaces. So we're not excluding, you know, people because they're trans. We're excluding people who are male, you know, who are men, who identify as women. And yes, they are going to be less safe within men's prisons. So therefore, and less safe within men's toilets. So therefore, for those people, let's make sure that we've got safe spaces for them. Now, the problem is that the trans lobby and these really aggressive extremist trans ideology activists won't accept that. They don't want any kind of compromise. They only accept trans women are women, and anything other than that they regard as bigoted. But I think there is a compromise there. I think it's going to require the government investing resources. I think it's going to require a proper conversation. And honestly, the sooner that conversation can be had, the less risk there is of more women being raped and attacked. But not just raped and attacked, but put at risk of being re-traumatized, which isn't fair, you know, within prisons, within refuges, within hospitals. Women need to they have the right to feel safe. The whole environment for a woman changes when they hear a male voice within that space. If they're in a state of undress or partial undress, it immediately changes. And so we have to recognize that we live within a sexist society where women are at more risk. And we make sure that we cater for that. We can't be telling children, if you know, some people are look as if they're men, but really they're a woman inside, because that takes away the child's ability to be able to name what they see and set safe boundaries for themselves, you know. So we have to respect reality. I think that's what I think Kelly J. Keane does that in the work that she does. I think the government is starting to. I don't think the left should let the government be the good guys on this. I think we need to just start talking and talk respectfully and make sure it's evidence-based when we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think our time's up, but just to close, where can people find you?
Oh, I've got a website which is called the Working Class Activist Network. So you can look that up, and my email is on there. It's classactivist@gmail.com.
Brilliant. And are you on social media?
Yeah, just Mandy Clare on Facebook, and on Twitter I'm @socialist Mandy.
Okay, brilliant. Mandy Clare, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you.